So we've been ordered off the air by the Civil Defense Emergency System, but we're staying on. We're not the only ones either. Much of the AM channels plan to continue to broadcast even in the face of this new opposition. So the top of the news today is that the dead have stood up and come to devour us all. And this shouldn't be new news, but I'm just going to keep saying it until someone listens. And I think that is exactly why we have been told to stop broadcasting, because the information that was well covered up before is now pretty much evident information in all cases. The reason for this kind of mass discussion at this point was regarding a top secret summit that was held just outside of Paris, France, and we're under the impression that this just happened today. Is the assumption was that a unified world would combat a common enemy, and what it appears to have happened is that did not take place. Russia and China both blamed the U.S. for inserting a weaponized agent, saying that these infected individuals were created on purpose with an intent to destabilize areas, and in some ways they state that this process had backfired. That doesn't make sense to us because the original outbreaks, as we knew, came from somewhere on the eastern seaboard. So that didn't seem like the case, but this was the constant blame game that we're seeing regarding everything that's going on. The U.S. countered by blaming a weaponized testing that was put forth in China, and even some sources have said that this was research that was funded by American dollars. At this point, I don't really think it's much of a matter one way or the other, because we're now in the situation that we must fix, but it seems to be that is the discussion that they want to have. Most other countries, on the other hand, had blamed the events on things like climate change, overpopulation, and in poison and other restrictions that were not placed on foodstuffs that had been processed out. Another thing that seemed to be counter to what scientists had been saying. The only thing they really agreed on during this meeting was that basically the world should be in quarantine, and that people should just stay in their homes and wait for further instructions. Again, this seems like a very misguided situation, and it seems that when we have these big meetings that the concept of misguided is exactly what we get from this process. It's the idea of let's fix it by not fixing it. And that's what we see is basically a placebo to cure the cancer that we all currently face. Scientists who did present said the global estimate of those lost to the plague would be estimated in the billions and could possibly, as they stated, it be a world-ending event. Even the use of the bomb was discussed as a last-ditch effort, but again, that was rejected by most present in the committee. About the only source that made any rational sense was a scientific study that deduced it was associated with some form of mad cow disease and placed its origins originally in Britain, which again did not seem to make much sense in the there's a lot of argument in the scientific community about where this came from and what source created it. Still, none of this was descriptive about what the illness actually was, and we've continued to see that has been an issue, trying to get to the bottom of this. Nothing we've seen so far in any of these discussions even seemed remotely rational. One scientist presented that melting ice caps due to climate change had uncovered a million-year-old bacteria that had somehow got its way into human food supply. So again, these are just things that people, I think at this point, are just trying to put out to try to get some sort of, I don't know if it's attention or glory or how they want to do that, just to have people listen to them for mere moments, but it is very reductive. In any case of any of the discussions that we've heard, they do not result in any sort of solution to the problem that we now face and are stuck in, other than to tell us that we need to stop talking about it, which in and of itself is not a solution. So much of this meeting obviously was held in secret, but it's today's day and age. We all know that nothing is secret. When multiple sources leaked what was in the discussion, including some had heard that there were recordings based on it. Whether those exist or not is questionable. There were agreements that were made offering access to research facilities, etc. But most of the damage has already been done due to the short period of time it took for this illness to take hold. And the other huge problem that you have is most of travel is banned or unable to be supported. Airports in general are effectively dead, other than personal usages by private individuals who use them on a case-by-case basis, and whether there is some sort of air traffic control in place is another question entirely. Primary communication lines are broken, and one scientist said that starvation will probably already be affecting close to 90% of the population of the planet at this time, if not soon enough. So this meeting has been considered a massive failure by anyone who has witnessed it or heard from it or been attended to it. Many individuals have been using systems that are in place. That's why I think this emergency broadcast system to come into play was that these leaders are using these one-time systems to basically say everybody else is at fault except for them. And that's what we've gone to. So we also deduced that much of the impact of the world, it explains why we've heard so little. So all these areas that have been affected in the world, so let's go over them individually. From what we've seen is they tend to blame each other. Let's see how everybody is doing when it comes to each situation. India, for instance, fell almost instantly. It swept over much of the country, every city, in days. It's assumed much of the survivors had headed towards the mountains or jungle areas, but information that we've seen to those areas is simply stopped. They did have a delegate at the meeting, but he said basically that he could neither provide assistance or even claim that assistance would be available. So there must be some sort of support structure there, but whether it is usable or not is a question. Areas like Cambodia, Vietnam, they were not present, but there are expectations of survivors that the difficult terrain situations have made mobility very limited. So many of the survivors are expected to have moved to areas that are more easily defended. China's major cities are and still are in dire straits. Every major city locked down very early. Food was being delivered but has since stopped with no way of escaping the buildings that they're being held in. And things are, for lack of a better term, very bad. It's assumed that these towers are now filled with infected behind locked doors. No questions of who is there, still able to respond to anything or not. And no military response plan has even engaged them. I think it's important to note that the reports of these Asian dead are much worse than what we've heard elsewhere as well. They've been described as fast-moving, snarling, some even use the words like animal, contrary to the slow-moving infected that we've seen in the States. And I think that this could be part of the idea of the closed spaces that they are involved in when it comes to this area. Russian elements have moved towards colder climates in hopes to alleviate the problem. They were very tight-lipped on the full situation analysis that they have, but assumed to be similar to everyone else. The countryside itself is considered safe, but cities such as Moscow have been completely shut down, and they were shut down on purpose, and apparently evacuations were done without announcement or knowledge to anyone out there. So if you had people that you knew in that area, you may not be able to come in contact with them. There were moves by their military forces at borders to attempt to capture other lands and other areas, but due to the situation that we had, a lot of the troops there were unable to do basically anything. They just basically fell back from their positions because they didn't really understand what was going on, and a bunch of troops themselves had problems where things fell apart. And again, this is stuff that we're hearing secondhand. We unfortunately do not know the full situation of a lot of what's going on there. So we're just getting kind of a description of what they are, and it's kind of forced us in some ways to fill in the blanks on it. So, and this is, it's true of every country. They've moved capitals to other areas. They're usually nearby the originals, but going to more rural settings. We've seen this consistently. Pretty much no matter what country we're going to be discussing here, that's going to be the going rate of information. Much of these areas were already constructed prior to events, so we're not talking about them getting up and moving to a farmhouse as a base command center. Many of these are set up as emergency shelters that were already made, many during the Cold War, that are just basically being used again to house and continue the idea of having some sort of country or infrastructure to make sure that chain of command is maintained throughout these situations. So we are under the impression that there is some sort of line of communication that continues among each one of the countries, and the question will be is how long is each one of these going to continue to have some sort of line of communication. So most of the European countries, for instance, are trying to organize into what they're calling survival camps in the countrysides. These are controlled by military leaders, and it appears that much of the British operations were being held in and around Manchester. With Scottish and Irish units were seen there directing together, working in tandem to try to secure each of their different areas or to unify some sort of force. The suggestion was to use marshes and old structures like castles as holding points, with a goal to secure the three areas to their original owners. The word is the royal family is still missing, though, and much of that leadership is coming from a military side of things instead of a political side. So whether they're still in contact with their politicians is questionable. The beauty of these situations now is that unlike the radio airwaves that were being blocked in much of these other countries, the airwaves have been opened. There is no infrastructure that allows them to cut off these lines of communication. They've been left open to allow people to use them as various communication points. Obviously, this did not happen in places like Russia and China, in more controlling areas of the world. You're not going to see that change over, but again, those areas are considered not to matter as much, other than from a defensive position. And that's something that I think is why the military had such involvement, is because originally their purposes were to defend borders, not just for military activity, but from the infected moving into those areas. Switzerland has said that they're using their standing military and moving into more mountainous terrains, using that to their advantage, and they actually have seemed to be holding out very well with the situations that they have. Again, before I move forward, you have to understand that the way the infection is happening is becoming more and more clear to people. The idea that you do not need to be infected directly. There is some other secondary form of infection is happening. So if anybody is considered dying, falling over, not around anymore, they have used something like burn pyres, burn pits, things of that nature to clear out, to make sure that the people who have left are no longer going to be a problem. It's something I really don't want to go over on air, because it's I consider very sensitive information. I hope that it's in everybody's mind, and if it's not, then I don't know how you're going to tell me otherwise, because there's not a lot of communication here. But if there is coming a point where we find out that a lot of people do not know what's going on or how to combat it, I think you clearly know that a person who is not responsive is a problem. So if you see these things, or there's things you do not know, we'd be happy to try to clarify a lot of it. Basically, the lines of combat are very clear. So I want to move over to Italy, who had reported it had lost all its major cities, but they have not seen the high rate of infections that others have, though. They also plan to use their terrains to their advantages. Places like Venice, for instance, provide a great deal of natural protection, but concerns about contaminated water are prevalent. And again, overcrowding, which we see everywhere, is becoming a big concern, because basically you have these people in infected areas that are deterrents, and usually these are large cities, and these large cities are moving into these sort of countryside situations and not bringing their own food sources with them. And you're seeing these places where originally there was a lot of friendliness of areas to say, look, we'll house people, and that has gotten to the point of where saturation, if you will. So how they're going to deal with that is going to be another situation entirely, and unfortunately we won't be able to speak on that from where we sit at this time. They say they have food to hold out for some time, speaking on Italy, but the conditions of that food is still going to be a concern because of the way it's stored in. If it does get contaminated, we could see the same kind of outbreak levels that we're seeing here. And again, we don't know how that contamination happens. The wordings from places like Africa, the Middle East, most of that is just non-existent. The Middle East leadership was thought to have been removed as cities began to fail very early on. We really lost contact with them for much of the time, and Israel is in question as well. It's assumed with the compacted population of these areas that survival would basically be minimum at best. Most of these individuals are going to move into places like, again, terrain-oriented areas, so deserts that are hard to traverse, mountains, any sort of area in there, and then changing how they deal with those who have died as a result of lack of, access to medication, natural illnesses, and the idea that there are some people who take matters into their own hands, if you will, or combat areas that do that. So in all these areas, it's difficult to disseminate the shooting from eliminating the dead as well, because are they fighting dead or are they fighting the living? So if you hear some sort of combat, the question is still whether that's real combat or not, or what's going on. And I think that's a problem that's also we're hearing from sort of leadership of saying they don't know where to put their forces or amass their movement against things, because it's pretty much a combat issue that's coming from the inside. And I think that's exacerbated the problem. As for America, Canada has been requesting assistance from the U.S. Whether that assistance has happened or not, originally the northern borders were sort of left open, if you will. We did have troops there that were stationed to put that in the area, but most of what we're hearing is that the Canada forces are working with the American forces to secure those borders. But again, Canada, whether that border actually exists or not at this point, and if it's just something where we're directly working together with what remains of their government. And again, we don't know where that standing government system is at this time. Mexico and the South have been mostly quiet. It was described earlier that cartel activity had upscaled, or as things began to fall apart, they had basically taken independent action. And it was said that they had a zero tolerance action plan against infected. And I think that was originally based on the assumption that the injuries caused infection, in that it could be maintained that well, and they had taken the steps to contain people who supposedly got infected. Now, with the new information, that could have changed greatly, and they are taking other actions to make sure that this doesn't expand out or take over any of the countries where they have some sort of influence. Regardless, it's clear that their purpose has changed course, and it could be directed solely at deterring the illness in a take-no-prisoners form of clearing. We're seeing a lot of, especially farmers there, that have joined forces in different areas to make sure that they're basically keeping the areas clear of any illness or infected. One of the things that they had targeted early too was the water supply, and to make sure that they understood what that entailed. But again, the larger cities have had zero chance to do anything. Those areas are still considered basically off limits, unlivable, and that's going to be the same pretty much wherever you go. That would explain also that there's a great deal of reports of combat in and around that entire area of the southern down. And regardless, no one was able to stop the fall of any of those areas that originally happened. Basically, there's been a backpedaling, and when we move into areas where things become more difficult to traverse, then you have a sort of defensive line that begins to form. The U.S. is beginning to organize from their original offensive. Military, which was told to stay at the borders, have not listened to those commands and have moved inwards in a move to assist National Guard and militia troops. Most of these militias have been organized or beginning to organize into a formation that has been known as Cerberus, whether that is a anecdotal name or if there is something more organized about that. Has not been made clear. A lot of the information is done through emergency radio channels and have put things together so that they can organize in a different way. But it is clear now that the military is working with these individuals to make them better. They become more and more organized as well. So these are ex-military individuals now that have joined ranks. So we're seeing a very military to military sort of conversation going on. That one reporter had described it as kind of waking up a grumpy old Marine that wants to get things done, and then once he's done, he can go back to bed. The truth is the command structure knows its way around and has been teaching skills to obviously younger soldiers in their ranks to make sure that survivability is at a maximum. So what we're seeing in effect is the old teaching the young how to survive this incident, and it's almost been in some ways refreshing to be able to see this sort of activity go together. What that's going to entail once we're over this, or if that's even available, are we really looking at billions? Are we seeing the wipeout of entire nations? How's that going to happen? We will just have to see when the dust settles. And I do think that this is something that I've said over and over again about the human race, is that we do find ways to survive, and that we do find ways to come together to make sure that at least some of us make it through and have these communication lines continue. I think that's key to everything that's going on, is to making sure that we continue to talk to each other, continue to get things done, and that we will continue to survive that way. But outside of that, just think of it this way: most cities are still in dire straits. New York declared an evacuation. Boston has set up a camp structure, but it's already said that it is short on food and resources, and there is been confirmed that there's no supply chain. So it is questionable if they can withstand the next straw that is going to land on their camel's back, and whether that city may actually have to take or enter into different directions. What path they're taking is questionable. California is literally falling apart in most of the southern part of the state. Reports of fights between hired soldiers, newly formed gangs of roaming marauders, looting, disruption, destruction, burning, fires, that kind of stuff. It's kind of at this point par for the course for California to be in this situation. They still have a huge amount of infected that they have to deal with, and it's considered an out of control situation. I think that we're going to see most people try to move towards the north, because if they lose a water supply, they are out. Vegas, for instance, has already basically called it, and they originally started to move towards the outer parts of the city, and at this point I think it's pretty much a ghost town. Chicago has been completely taken over by gang activity. National Guard even no longer functions in the state as a whole. Many of them just lost key leadership at the very beginning of the combat and called it a day. They moved out. Colorado has made moves to set up walled cities, and they're using National Guard now as a police force versus a deterrent force. They're basically falling back and holding a line. So what we truly know now is that, from all we've seen so far, is the reality at this point is that borders do no longer exist. The problem of combating the infected is going to come internally as well as externally, and those new borders are set up by our enemy and not those that are trying to fight it. So Some of you are going to find that as a great thing, others are not, and that's where we are, regardless of how you want to take it. The idea that borders officially just, there's no thought process to that now. If you can survive, you will survive. That's just how it's going to go. It's now a fight for survival by anyone and everyone, and many have taken up themselves to defend their positions. But having an organized system, we already see, is going to be the most effective way of doing things. And we do have, thankfully, in the U.S., we do have people who are taking activity to do that. The reality that I would tell anybody outside of the East and West have effectively been negated in some way, especially any sort of city, and that actions are going to be taken probably towards moving towards the center of the U.S. as some kind of holding position. But the thing is that does not bode well for those who are still remaining in areas that have seen a great deal of activity over the last few weeks. And that activity is becoming more and more advanced, and where it's going is a question. If you are in an area that you don't know how you're going to be infected, and you're drinking water, you're eating whatever food you can find, if you're in those areas, it's unknown about how long you can survive before you basically run into something that will infect you, or in something that you eat or come in contact with that will infect you and make you basically a ticking time bomb. So there's a huge balancing act that we have here. So the question of who is going to survive this is up in the air. Much of the instructions has been to fight for yourself and take the steps you need to survive. So even with the rules, the truth is there are no rules. You have to take the necessary steps that you need to, and unfortunately you are on your own. Nobody is coming to rescue. Nobody is coming to give you instructions or direct you in your path. You will need to do some sort of, there is no rules for this fight. There is a simple do we have to survive kind of thinking. Sometimes that's negative, sometimes that's positive. We hope that there is a moral system that comes into play with that, but we have already seen in some areas that that structure does not exist. So the term defense is going to be very important to how we move forward. So for us, we're going to remain on the air as long as we can, even with the mandates to close down all civil broadcast stations and broadcast emergency networks only. The real question is who's going to punish us if we stay on. So we're going to continue as long as we can. So maintain yourself. Everybody stay safe. Make sure you dial into the channel, and we're going to see you in the next broadcast.